Lenox Avenue was alive the way it always was after dark. Music bled from second-floor windows. A trumpet argued with a piano somewhere above the street. Dice slapped pavement. Laughter rose and fell like it had nothing to fear. Then the scream came. Not loud enough to stop the music, but sharp enough to cut through it. It wasn't the kind of scream people perform. It wasn't drunken. It wasn't dramatic. It was short. Panicked. Choked off too quickly. Men glanced at each other. And then they did what men in a city learn to Donnerstag. They kept walking. A fruit vendor adjusted his crate without looking up. Two young hustlers suddenly found the cracks in the sidewalk fascinating. A couple arguing near the corner lowered their voices, pretending not to hear what they had clearly heard. Harlem understood danger. And it understood minding your business even better. Across the street, Bumpy Johnson was mid-conversation. He stood outside a brownstone, head tilted just enough to shade his eyes. His posture was relaxed, one hand resting lightly on a cane he didn't need but preferred. Two men stood with him, one talking too much, the other nodding too often. Money was being discussed. Future arrangements. Territory that required patience. Then the scream reached him. He didn't flinch. He didn't whip his head around like the others had. He simply stopped listening. The man in front of him kept talking for another 2 seconds before realizing the air had changed. His words trailed off. Bumpy's eyes shifted, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to locate the direction of the sound. An alley. Halfway down the block. The street tried to swallow the moment. The music resumed its dominance. Someone forced a laugh that didn't belong. But Bumpy was no longer in the conversation. "Excuse me," he said quietly. Not to ask permission. Just to end the discussion. He stepped away from the brownstone. The two men watched him move, uncertain whether to follow. They didn't ask questions. They knew better. When Bumpy Johnson changed direction, you let him. He walked at the same pace he always walked. Measured. Unhurried. Cane touching pavement with a soft, rhythmic tap. Tip. 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 The alley grew clearer as he approached. Shadows moved inside it, too many shadows for one frightened voice. Another muffled cry. This one weaker. A few feet away, a group of young men leaned against a lamppost. They had heard it too. One of them shifted his weight, considering whether to intervene. Then he saw Bumpy walking toward the alley. And he stepped back. Not out of fear. Out of recognition. The responsibility had shifted. A car rolled slowly past the block, then kept going. Windows upstairs dimmed slightly as curtains moved just enough for eyes to peek through. Harlem was watching. Not loudly. But completely. Bumpy paused at the mouth of the alley. He didn't enter immediately. He listened. Breathing. Scuffling. A low male voice muttering something impatient. The rustle of fabric against brick. He adjusted his head with 2 fingers. There were easier choices tonight. He had a dinner waiting uptown. Men from downtown were ready to talk numbers. There were risks involved, opportunities that required careful timing. Walking away from those talks could cost him leverage. Power required presence. And yet, he stood there, listening to a stranger fighting to breathe. People sometimes misunderstood men like Bumpy Johnson. They believed the streets belonged to whoever had the most muscle, the most guns, the loudest threats. They were wrong. The streets belonged to whoever decided what was allowed. Bumpy stepped into the alley. The light from Lenox Avenue followed him halfway, then surrendered to shadow. The cane's tap softened against the damp ground. 3 figures. One woman pressed against a brick wall. A hand over her mouth. Another gripping her wrist. They hadn't noticed him yet. That was the first mistake. Bumpy stopped 3 steps in. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't shout. He simply stood there long enough for his presence to become undeniable. One of the men glanced back. His expression shifted. Recognition spreads differently than fear. Fear is sudden. Recognition is slower. It crawls across the face as understanding settles in. The man nudged the others. They turned. For a second, no one spoke. The woman's eyes moved past the hands holding her, searching the darkness. When she saw him, she didn't recognize power. She recognized stillness. And stillness felt safer than chaos. Bumpy's gaze moved from one man to the next. He didn't look angry. He didn't look excited. He looked disappointed. As if they had tracked mud into a room that was supposed to be clean. "You boys," he said, voice even, almost conversational. That was all. No threats. No raised tone. Just acknowledgement. The grip on the woman's wrist loosened slightly. One of the men forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're just talking, Mr. Johnson. Just talking." The lie hung there, thin and fragile. Bumpy glanced at the woman's face. Tears. Panic. A red mark forming along her jaw. He didn't ask her what happened. He didn't need testimony. He turned his eyes back to the men. The alley felt smaller now. Tighter. Outside, the street noise seemed distant, like it belonged to another city entirely. Bumpy took one more step forward. Tip. The cane echoed softly against brick. And in that quiet space between heartbeats, everyone understood something. Whatever happened next wouldn't be loud. But it would matter. The alley did not belong to the 3 men anymore. It belonged to the silence Bumpy Johnson brought with him. No one moved. The woman's breathing was uneven, desperate. The man closest to her still held her wrist, but his grip had changed. It was no longer control. It was uncertainty. Bumpy let the quiet stretch. Power, real power, never rushes to prove itself. It lets other men feel the weight of their own decisions first. "You're blocking the air," Bumpy said calmly. "Not to all of them. Just to the one with his hand over her mouth." The man hesitated. That hesitation told Harlem everything it needed to know. He removed his hand. The woman gasped, pulling in breath like she'd been underwater. She didn't run. She stayed frozen against the wall, eyes wide, trying to understand what had just shifted. Bumpy stepped closer, placing himself between her and the mouth of the alley. Not shielding her with drama. Just positioning. "A barrier without announcing it. You know where you are?" he asked the man. His tone wasn't angry. It was instructive. One of them swallowed. "Yes, sir. Sir." The word came automatically. Because even men who flirt with chaos understand hierarchy. "This is Harlem," Bumpy said. "And Harlem has rules." No one argued. From the street, 2 older men had drifted closer to the alley entrance. They didn't step inside. They didn't need to. Their presence was witness enough. A shopkeeper stood in his doorway, wiping already clean hands on a towel. Watching. The young man by the lamppost had gone still, like students observing a lesson they would remember for the rest of their lives. Bumpy glanced back at the woman briefly. "You live around here?" he asked gently. She shook her head. That mattered. Stranger. No family on this block. No brothers nearby. No one to step in. Harlem could be hard on strangers. It could test them. Swallow them. But it did not devour the helpless. Not under Bumpy Johnson. He faced the men again. "You thought nobody would mind," he said. It wasn't a question. One of them found his voice. We beyond. Bumpy lifted a single finger. The explanation died mid-sentence. You thought, Bumpy continued evenly, that this was just another alley. His eyes moved slowly between them. And that no one important would care. The air tightened. Because now they understood the mistake. It wasn't about the woman. It was about disrespect. Not toward her. Toward the order of the street. Bumpy Johnson did not rule Harlem through random violence. He ruled it through expectation. Merchants paid him because their windows stayed unbroken. Musicians played late because no one dragged them off stage. Children ran errands after sunset because they believed the sidewalks had boundaries. He had built that belief brick by brick. And these three men had decided to chip at it. Bumpy turned slightly, addressing the woman without taking his eyes off them. Walk to the corner, he said softly. There's a diner with a blue awning. Sit inside. Tell them I sent you. She hesitated. He gave a small nod. That was enough. She slipped past him carefully, not running, but moving quickly. As she reached the alley entrance, the older men outside stepped aside for her like ushers in a quiet ceremony. One of them murmured something reassuring. She disappeared toward the corner. Now it was just the four of them. And the street watching. Bumpy rested both hands lightly on the top of his cane. You three from here? He asked. A pause. No. He nodded once. I can tell. It wasn't an insult. It was fact. Because men from Harlem understood something instinctively, you don't create fear where protection has already been promised. Bumpy stepped closer again. Not enough to threaten. Just enough to remove comfort. You made her scream, he said quietly. The words were simple. But they carried accusation heavier than any shouted threat. One of the men tried to stand straighter, reclaim something. We didn't know, that's the problem, Bumpy interrupted gently. You didn't know. You didn't ask. You didn't consider. That was the real offense. From the street, someone coughed nervously. A car slowed down but didn't stop. The city felt suspended, waiting to see what kind of king stood in that alley. Because kings are measured by what they punish. And what they protect. Bumpy let the silence press in again. He didn't need to raise his voice. They already understood the danger. But danger wasn't the lesson. Order was. You don't do that here, Bumpy said. 4 words. Not dramatic. Not poetic. But absolute. One of the men nodded too quickly. Yes, sir. Sir again. Bumpy studied their faces one last time. He wasn't memorizing them for revenge. He was deciding whether they were capable of learning. Harlem didn't need more bodies. It needed boundaries. The streetlights flickered slightly overhead. Somewhere down the block, a piano resumed playing, tentative at first, then stronger. Life wanted to continue. Bumpy adjusted his hat. You're going to walk out of this alley, he said evenly. Slowly. They didn't argue. You're going to apologize to that woman. In the diner. Where people can hear you. All 3 stiffened. Public. That was worse than a beating. You're going to pay for her meal. And you're going to leave this neighborhood. His gaze sharpened just slightly. And if I hear your voices on this block again, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because sometimes restraint paints a clearer picture than violence ever could. The men nodded. All of them. Bumpy stepped aside, granting them passage toward the street. But as they walked past him, they felt it, the quiet understanding that Harlem had a guardian. And he did not need to shout. From the alley entrance, the onlookers parted just enough to let the 3 men through. No one spoke to them. No one jeered. The humiliation was quiet. Intentional. Bumpy remained in the alley a moment longer. Alone. Listening to the city breathe again. He hadn't thrown a punch. He hadn't drawn a weapon. But something had been reinforced tonight. A message without blood. Harlem wasn't wild territory. It was protected ground. And Bumpy Johnson did not abandon his people. Not even for strangers. He stepped back onto Lenox Avenue. The music was louder now. The dice rolled again. Conversation resumed. But the way people looked at him had shifted just slightly. Not fear. Not worship. Something steadier. Trust. The three men walked out of the alley like students leaving a principal's office. Shoulders stiff. Eyes forward. Pride folding inward with every step. Harlem made space for them, but not out of courtesy. Out of observation. Bumpy Johnson followed a few paces behind. Not chasing. Not crowding. Just close enough to remind them that consequences don't end at the mouth of an alley. The diner with the blue awning glowed softly at the corner. Light spilled onto the sidewalk like a quiet invitation. Inside, the woman sat at the counter, hands wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't touched. A waitress stood near her, protective without being obvious. When the door opened and the three men stepped in, the bell above it rang once. Every fork paused midair. The men hesitated. This was no longer shadow work. This was exposure. Bumpy entered last. He removed his head slowly and nodded to the owner behind the register, a small acknowledgement between men who understood the same responsibility. The owner nodded back. No words. The first of the three men approached the counter. His voice was low. Too low. Bumpy cleared his throat gently. Not aggressive. Corrective. The man swallowed and tried again, louder this time. I'm sorry. The word hung awkwardly in the air. The woman looked up at him. Not forgiving. Not furious. Just steady now. Say it properly, Bumpy said. Still calm. Still controlled. The man straightened slightly. I'm sorry for what we did, it won't happen again. Silence. The other two repeated it, each more uncomfortable than the last. This wasn't about humiliation for sport. It was about restoration. The waitress placed a menu in front of the woman. The first man reached into his coat and pulled out a roll of cash. He set it on the counter. Bumpy glanced at it once. Leave it, he said. The man did. No negotiation. No protest. They backed away from the counter slowly, careful not to brush against anyone. The room parted just enough for them to reach the door. The bell rang again as they stepped outside. And Harlem exhaled. Bumpy remained inside. He placed his hat back on his head and approached the counter. You all right? He asked the woman. She nodded. A tear slid down her cheek, but her voice was steady now. Yes. He studied her for a moment. Not suspicious. Just ensuring. You got somewhere safe to go, he asked. My sister lives on 135th, she said quietly. He nodded. To the owner, he said, send someone to walk her there. The owner didn't hesitate. Of course. Because this was how it worked. Protection wasn't random. It was organized. Intentional. Shared. Bumpy didn't look at the cash on the counter again. It wasn't payment for him. It was a symbol. A reminder. He turned to leave. As he stepped back onto Lenox Avenue, he spotted the three men halfway down the block. They were walking faster now, eager to disappear into streets that didn't know his name the same way. But they weren't gone yet. Gentlemen. His voice carried without effort. They froze. Slowly, they turned. Bumpy didn't move closer this time. He spoke from where he stood, allowing the entire block to hear. "You were given a lesson tonight," he said. The street quieted again, just slightly. "If you take it, we'll be fine." A pause. "If you don't," he let the rest remain unfinished. The men nodded, more solemn now than frightened. Then they walked. And this time, no one stepped aside for them. Bumpy watched. Until they turned the corner and vanished. One of the young men from the lamppost approached cautiously. "You did have to do that, Mr. Johnson," he said. Bumpy looked at him. "That's exactly why I did," he replied. The young man absorbed that. Because power that only shows up when necessary isn't leadership. Power that shows up when it's inconvenient touts authority. The brownstone conversation from earlier waited somewhere behind him. Money still on the table. Negotiations still unfinished. He glanced down the avenue. For a moment, he considered returning immediately. But Harlem was still processing what had just happened. He could feel it. A woman stepped out of a nearby building and gave him a small nod of gratitude. An old man tipped his hat. A group of boys stopped pretending not to stare. No applause. No cheers. Just acknowledgement. An acknowledgement, in a neighborhood like this, was currency. Bumpy resumed walking, not toward the brownstone, but down the block instead. Letting himself be seen. Letting the message settle into storefronts and stoops and second-floor windows. He didn't need to announce what he had done. Harlem would tell it for him. By morning, the story would travel faster than newspapers. It wouldn't grow louder in the telling. It would grow steadier. 3 men. 1 alley. A scream that stopped a king mid-step. And a king who chose to answer it not with rage, but with order. As Bumpy turned the corner, disappearing into the rhythm of the city, he quietly commanded, one truth settled over Lenox Avenue: protection wasn't a favor. It was policy. And Bumpy Johnson enforced it without ever raising his voice. The brownstone lights were still on. Through the front window, silhouettes moved behind heavy curtains. Men in pressed suits. Cigars. Whiskey poured into short glasses that cost more than most people on Lenox made in a week. They were waiting for Bumpy Johnson. Inside, numbers sat on paper. Routes mapped in ink. Partnerships that could stretch his reach beyond Harlem, downtown, maybe further. Power layered upon power. Opportune. An opportunity, in Bumpy's world, did not knock twice. He stood across the street for a moment, watching the house. The city hummed behind him. Harlem had returned to its rhythm, but the rhythm had changed key. Something steadier now. Something rooted. One of his men approached from the shadows. "Thierry asking for you," the man said quietly. Bumpy did look at him. "I know. They don't like to wait." Bumpy gave the faintest smile. "Then TLL learn." He crossed the street slowly, cane touching pavement with that same deliberate cadence. When he reached the door, it opened before he knocked. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and expectation. 4 men turned to face him. One checked his watch. Another leaned back in his chair, irritation poorly disguised as indifference. "You really late?" the man at the head of the table said. Bumpy removed his hat and set it carefully on a side table. "I was occupied." "With what?" the man pressed. Bumpy walked to the table but didn't sit immediately. He let his gaze travel across the room, measuring tone, temperature, ego. "Something more important than this," he said evenly. A flicker of offense crossed one face. Another man scoffed softly. "More important than expansion," someone muttered. Bumpy finally took his seat. "Yes." No explanation. No apology. Just that. The room tightened. These were not street boys. These were businessmen who wore violence like a cufflink, polished, subtle, always available. They respected strength. But they valued profit more. You walked away from leverage tonight, the man at the head of the table said carefully. Bumpy leaned back slightly. No, he replied. I reinforced it. Silence. He let them sit with that. Because leverage wasn't only about territory. It wasn't only about supply lines and percentages. It was about perception. Harlem didn't belong to whoever had the largest shipment. It belonged to whoever the people believed in. If Harlem believes I'll ignore a scream, Bumpy continued calmly, then Harlem stops believing in me. He looked each man in the eye, one by one. And if Harlem stops believing in me, then none of this paper means anything. No one interrupted him. They couldn't. Because even men obsessed with profit understand one principle: control without loyalty is temporary. The man who had checked his watch earlier leaned forward now, studying Bumpy differently. You retelling us, he said slowly, you delayed this meeting, for a stranger? Bumpy didn't blink. I'm telling you, he said, voice steady, there are no strangers on my streets. That landed. Not loudly. But deeply. The irritation in the room shifted into calculation. These men weren't sentimental. They didn't care about the woman in the alley. They cared about what Bumpy's choice revealed. It revealed discipline. It revealed boundaries. It revealed that his authority wasn't fragile enough to be distracted by convenience. And that made him dangerous in a different way. The man at the head of the table nodded once. Fair enough, he said. The tension eased not because they agreed morally, but because they understood strategically. Bumpy reached for the papers on the table. Now, he said calmly, let's talk numbers. The meeting resumed. Figures were debated. Lots negotiated. Percentages adjusted by fractions that would ripple for years. But something subtle had shifted in the room. No one questioned his timing again. No one hinted at inconvenience. Because they understood something clearly now, Bumpy Johnson didn't chase power. Power adjusted to him. Hours later, when the meeting finally ended and agreements were sealed with quiet handshakes, one of the men lingered behind. You could send someone else to handle that alley, he said thoughtfully. Bumpy placed his hat back on his head. I could have. But you didst. No. The man studied him for a long second. That's why Harlem's yours, he admitted quietly. Bumpy didn't respond. He stepped outside into the cool night air. Lenox Avenue had thinned. Street lights buzzed softly. The city was tired but awake. Across the block, a small group of boys reenacted what they thought had happened earlier, dramatic gestures, exaggerated whispers. They stopped when they saw him. One of them straightened instinctively. Bumpy gave them a brief nod. Nothing more. But that nod would live in their memory longer than any story they told tonight. He began walking home. Not rushed. Not triumphant. Just steady. He had paused empire for principle. And somehow, that choice had strengthened both. Because abandoning everything for a moment had reminded the city exactly who he was. Not just a man with influence. Not just a name that carried weight. But a leader who understood that legacy isn't built in boardrooms alone. It's built in alleys. In small decisions. In the quiet refusal to look away. And Harlem had seen him refuse.